And I knew we were going to have a small group today because a lot of people are out of town, and it's just that time of year. But today, I'm calling today corrections. Calling today corrections because we're going to continue with Titus. And because this is the first class, we just got through September where I've actually begun publishing these lessons. And so some of you have purchased them. And the nice thing about these new publications is that they are print on demand, which means that unlike the older way they published books, you publish, I don't know, hundreds of books, put them in a warehouse, and then try to sell them. They only print these up whenever somebody orders them. So the advantage then is that you can go back and make adjustments electronically without having to produce a whole new edition. So I was going through Titus. We had a lot of good conversation last week, and I hadn't taught this lesson on the pastorals for many, many years. And I'm going through it, and I'm thinking, there's some things I need to change. And especially when you put something out there for publication, it's a little bit different because it's out there and you're like, all right, I got my big name on the top of it. So today I want to begin with some things going through the book of Titus, looking at the Greek text and looking at the material that I've taught in past years. Things that here at 47 years old, I look back and I say to myself, I'd like to change that. So this will be an interesting class for you. And I think before we go into the specifics, just as a general rule, one of the things that I think is very important within Protestant circles is to stay close to the text, to always come back to the text. There's a saying by an old Bible scholar, and I think it's a great saying, that we should not use the Bible to persuade ourselves of why it is we think we've been right all along. We should use that's why we have the Bible here when I'm up there preaching behind the pulpit. We should have the Bible to remind us of where perhaps we haven't always been listening as closely as we could have. The Bible is there as a counterpoint. Like in music, you have a melody, but then there's a counterpoint to challenge the way we've been thinking about things so that we do not dominate the biblical text. But the Bible is always there to correct us and give us new insight and fresh perspective. So this week, there's a few things I want to do. I thought I would finish Titus this week. I'll probably finish it next week. In the back there. But this was a very fruitful week for me. It's a short book. It's such a short book. And as I went through the lesson, I thought, there's a few things that need to be changed. So there it is. And I'll probably split the book of 1st and 2nd Timothy into two separate books because each of them is deserving of their own treatment. Did you have a question or comment?
Since this is a pre-correction copy, I think it was worth something.
You can hang on to that. It'll probably be worth something someday if I'm ever important. But you should know that the copy that you have has been adjusted. And so now I have a new publishing agency, and they're doing print on demand, and I'm experimenting with it. So I didn't tell anybody about it on the front end because I knew this would happen. I knew that with anything that I put out there, there would probably be 3 or 4 different versions within a short space of time before I stepped back and said, okay, that's the one we're going to go with. But to start with, I'll just go in chronological order. So we're in Titus. And we talk about the setting of the letter. Very well and very good. I wanted to add a little bit about the island of Crete. And this is from the introduction to our class. And this is not really in the lessons that I handed out, and so I'll just say it off the top of my head. But the first correction that I wanted to, it's not so much a correction as it is an expansion, at least in this case. The island of Crete, if you go back to early Western civilization, it is considered the earliest of our Western civilizations. You've probably heard of the Minoans or King Minos of Crete, the big cities of Knossos. You can still visit them if you're over on the island. Now, eventually, they would be conquered by the Greeks. And there's some legends about Theseus, the king of Athens, who was, you've heard the myth of him being sent to King Minos's labyrinth where he defeats the Minotaur. Maybe you heard that story. And what's that?
We see the Minotaur if we go to Crete?
If we go to Crete, you might not see the Minotaur, but you will definitely see murals of bulls in the palaces that are still there.
No Minotaur, no labyrinth if we go to Crete.
But it's there. Minos's Taurus, the Minotaur, is there in Greece. Now, after the Greeks took over Crete, Crete maintained its independence. We did this in the class on Jeremiah. You had the rise of these great empires, the Assyrians, the Babylonians, the Persians. And Crete maintained its independence. By the time of the Roman Empire, because the island of Crete was right there in the middle of the Aegean, and nobody had taken it over, my research this past week revealed to me, and I wish Nate, my youngest son, was here because he would love this, that Crete was a favorite hangout of pirates. Nate is really big on pirates. Pirates, not of the Caribbean, pirates of the Mediterranean. So if they ever make a island amusement park on Crete, it'll be called Pirates of the Mediterranean. And that actually fed into the reputation of the Cretans. I spoke of that at the beginning of the class, but I don't know that I gave a good explanation for it. I don't know that I had one. We do have Paul quoting a famous poet who says Cretans are liars and charlatans. But we don't really have an explanation of why that was the case. And so the first thing I want to add to today's lesson is that Crete was a pirate island. Pirates had not been conquered by the great civilizations. They put their ships out to sea. They plundered other ships. They murdered people. They took the plunder back to Crete. They were liars and thieves. And you can imagine what the climate on the island of Crete was with those kinds of people doing those kinds of operations. So that was something new that I found out, and I wanted to share it with you. In part because my wife's a big fan of Walt Disney World. We visit Pirates of the Caribbean, but I was thinking, Pirates of the Mediterranean. So there it is, Pirates of the Mediterranean. Because I had heard that Paul in this letter quotes this famous poet that Cretans are liars and charlatans. And I knew from the letter, as we had read it over the past several weeks, that the moral climate on the island of Crete was poor. But I don't know that I ever knew why. And so I thought, well, this is interesting. Now, That ties into Rome because when Julius Caesar was consul with Pompey, they were given power to wipe out the pirates on the Mediterranean. That's the Roman Senate had given them extra military power to do that, and that's when Crete finally was conquered by the Romans. That's interesting, though, because that plays into history. Of course, Julius Caesar, when he got that extra power, everybody knows that he didn't want to give it up, and that's why he got murdered on the floor of the Senate on the Ides of March. Okay, yeah. After he had been given all of that military power, he didn't really want to give it up, and he knew he had a chance to take over the government. But in many ways, it tied in interestingly with our letter of Titus. I thought, wow, that's interesting, Julius Caesar. This is when he took over the island of Crete, and precisely because it was a place where pirates hung out. So that's the first thing that I worked through this week that I wanted to share with you. Let me see if there's any questions about that before I move on. There's a couple things that I discovered, and I wanted to share them as they come up. Eli.
So the church that Titus is attempting to run is stationed on the island of Crete.
Mm-hmm.
And if Julius Caesar took over the island and got rid of all these pirates...
And he's dead now, Julius Caesar. Yeah.
Oh, yeah, but was that campaign against the pirates on the island of Crete part of the Roman persecution of Christianity, given that the church was there, or no?
That's a good question. After Caesar took over Crete and absorbed it into the Roman Empire, he got murdered. His son Augustus became Caesar, and by the time of Paul, several Caesars had come and gone. We don't know that the island of Crete was directly persecuted by the Roman Caesars at this time. But to your question, this is maybe a second thing that I'll raise for our class today. We talked about whether or not Paul wrote this letter. Remember? Okay. Now, that's important to Christians for different reasons. Mostly because I think the letter begins with, I, Paul, to Titus. But you read that, it's like, well, I don't want to question that. On the other hand, if, for example, this letter was written by a later person writing in the spirit of Paul, then that would change the historical context, because there would have been one, maybe two massive Christian persecutions that had happened by the time this letter was written. That's important, because when we get to 1 Timothy, the advice given to the churches in Ephesus to obey the ruling authorities, to pray for the ruling authorities, to support the ruling authorities, would be against the backdrop against several decades of persecution by the ruling authorities. That makes sense? We do see that in the pastoral epistles, Titus, 1 Timothy and 2 Timothy, there is, if you've read the relevant passages, pray for the kings. Pray for the governing authorities. That's true. Christians have done that for thousands of years now. But it would be interesting when that was written, right? If that was written after the days of Paul, then that would be evident that the church is trying very, very hard to survive in a hostile environment. So that's a second thing worthy of raising. Let's see if there's any other questions. I'm not going to go any further into that. That's a good question. It's such a short letter, and I've been spending time with it, thinking about it, going over the text. The second thing, though, that I wanted to address goes back to chapter 1, verse 5, with the appointing of elders, which I think in my original lesson was entitled Establishing Church Structure. This section here I have re-entitled The Appointing of Elders, and this might affect my own view of whether or not Paul wrote these letters. I don't detect a whole lot here in terms of establishing a massive church structure. The only thing that is really being brought up here is elders to look over the church. So one of the main arguments against Pauline authorship is that there seems to be urged an elaborate church structure, which would only be appropriate in the later days of the church. As I look over these texts, I wonder whether or not that's the case. Establishing elders in various cities is not the establishing of an elaborate church structure. So I'll just throw that out there. There's an uncertainty. The main thing that I changed here, though, and I want to draw attention to it, and it came up last week. Chapter 2, verse, let's find it here. Chapter 1, verse 6. If anyone is above reproach, the husband of one wife, and his children are believers, and not open to the charge of debauchery or insubordination. Okay, so my second major correction today, I want to challenge that translation in the ESV. We talked about this last week, and in this verse, his children are believers. The Greek text, tekna ekon pista, can be translated having believing children. However, it can also be translated having faithful children in the Greco-Roman sense of faithful to their families, and I do believe the present context favors the latter, because the qualifying phrase is that the children are to be obedient and self-controlled. We've seen that Paul wants to make sure that the elders of the church are men who can run their families well. The issue there, then, is not necessarily that his children are believers in the religious sense, but that they are faithful to their families. In other words, that he runs his family in an orderly fashion. And I think that came out actually last week. But I think the translation that we have in the ESV is misleading in this regard. So I have the Greek phrase here, tekna ekon pista. And pista, pious or faithful, especially with the qualifying phrase. So first correction I made today, correction expansion, Crete is an island of pirates. Second thing, I don't think there's anything in this text that says that the elder has to have all of his kids be religious believers. The best translation here, and here I'm going to go against our own ESV, is that his children are faithful to their families. And I have to find some footnotes. There's several scholars that agree with this, good scholars, I don't just mean spurious ones, that feel that it fits the sense of the passage. Because that's always something that's bothered me. when I've read this in traditional translations, because I've thought, well, you can't guarantee that your kids are going to be, we even say in Christian circles, God has no grandchildren. You can't force them into the faith. Yes?
But also, if they're believers, they shouldn't be debauchery, they shouldn't be really the next two things.
Right. If they were believers, why would you then have to go on and say that they weren't debauchers and insubordinate? Presumably, if they were believers, that wouldn't be an issue.
The culture was that way, so you'd probably be tempted to slip into that.
Exactly.
It's similar to today. And actually, I want to confess out in a dozen situations. It's my own company, so I'm the best against myself. But I might be better.
Well, one reason I wanted to bring up the second point is because I grew up in a church, and many of you did too, where, and I don't think there's anything wrong with it at all. You read something in the Bible, you're zealous to do what it says. Absolutely. This is God's word. You want to do what it says. But then the issue of translation becomes important. Now, I do understand that there are unscrupulous scholars who fiddle-faddle with the text to try to get it to say what they want it to say. So I'm not talking about those people. But on the other hand, there are Bible translations that, for good intent, no doubt, continue to press forward renderings of the text that I don't think are always helpful to us. So, this is one of them. I would argue, and then if you want to do some homework on this, that Titus chapter 1, verse 6, that the best translation is not that his children are believers and not open to debauchery or insubordination, but that his children are faithful. That is to say, faithful to their family. Therefore, they are subordinate to their parents. Therefore, they are not debauchers. Maybe they are believers, maybe they're not believers. But the elder has control of his household. And that strikes me as a much better rendering of the Greek here and makes much more sense. Let me see if there's any questions about that. That's my second correct. Today's lesson is called Corrections. That's my second. And I don't too often in a Bible class cut across a translation that we have in the English. But this is one of them where I'm like, yeah, I think that one probably has to be addressed.
You know what, Towner, my favorite.
What's that?
My favorite commentator, Titus, on Pastoral, he says the same thing either.
Oh, well, who's that?
Towner.
Okay, so I've got a second from his favorite Bible.
I was just curious how you were asking the question, what he would say. He said it could be rendered, he said it could be rendered either way. He didn't really, not a commentator, but it's like it could be rendered either way. But he did specifically.
Could be rendered either way.
So it just shows your grasp of the Greek equates with his.
It's basically on the footnote in the ESV, there, at the bottom of the page, there's a 5, verse 5, and it says faithful, which can be taken more than one way.
But it's good that it was put in the footnote. Increasingly, scholars do that because they know that when they move from the Greek to the English, they have made a decision. And in older translations, they wouldn't even footnote it. So it's good that they do that because they're just telling you, the reader, that they've made a choice in this matter. So I want to recommend that because I've certainly been in and out of many conservative churches where incredible pressure has been put on the religious leaders that all of their kids be believers because of this passage. And I've never felt comfortable with it, but on the other hand, when you're up against a Bible passage, you want to do whatever you think that it says, And if you go back to the Greek, you want to find out what the Greek is saying. It's not that you want to use your knowledge of Greek to twist it to get it to say what you want it to say. You want to understand what it's actually saying. So that's a big one. That's a big one that I wrestled with this week. So I hope this is helpful to you. We're not a big group today, but I want you to know that as I go through these lessons, I'm not just serving you up leftovers. We wrestle with the text. That's why we have these Bible classes. We read the text, we go back through it, and we try to find how can we better align ourselves with what the Lord is asking us to do, using all of our strength and power to pursue these things. In chapter 1, verse 10, a big problem I re-entitled this from what I had here. In the original lesson, I had the problem of false teachers. Chapter 1, verses 10 to 16. I have re-entitled this section, The Problem of Subversive Teachers. And I'm going to write those words on the board because it might sound like a distinction without a difference. In my older lesson, I said the problem of false teachers, but I want to talk about subversive teachers. Because in this section, chapter 1, verse 10, there are many who are insubordinate, is how Paul begins. Now, that's an important word, because if you're in a religious setting, you're going to have all different kinds of Bible teachers. You're going to have Bible teachers who come from Anglican backgrounds, Pentecostal backgrounds, Baptist, Catholic, Orthodox, whatever. If they're true Bible teachers, they're not always going to agree with each other, but they are commending to you what they think God's Word is. They want to be obedient to what God is saying. But this phrase here, insubordinate, empty talkers, and deceivers, especially those of the circumcision party, chapter 1, verse 10, I'm going to call subversive. There are people who enter into religious communities not believing in those communities in the first place. They enter into them with the preconceived idea of changing them. And that's subversion. That's not, and so I don't like the word false here. The third change I want to make to this lesson is a distinction between false and subversive, and I think it's relevant to our time. Because I am a sincere Bible teacher, and I've met many other sincere Bible teachers, and we don't always agree about everything. But we're not subversives. I've never joined a church that I didn't believe in because I thought I was going to be a Trojan horse and change it from the inside out. That's subversion. And that's what Paul is addressing in this passage. They don't subordinate themselves to the teachings of the apostles. They've already decided that Jesus is not the Messiah. But they see that a lot of people are putting their faith in him, and they've got their thumb in the wind, and they're following where the crowd goes in the hopes of drawing those people to themselves. So this will come up in 1 Timothy 2, which is why I bring it up here. I want to bring up this idea of subversion. Because Paul speaks very aggressively against this group. And I always wrestled with that. You know, he says things like, They are detestable, disobedient, unfit for any good work. Chapter 1, verse 16. Now, you would have to cross some lines before I said that about you. Detestable, disobedient, unfit for any good work. And so I thought a good deal about, there's more going on here than just false teaching.
Talking about the Cretans there, or the circumcision?
The circumcision group. He's saying that
Because they, that's a whole different, that's almost like you don't need faith, you need outward signs of, circumcision instead of faith in Jesus.
exactly, this circumcision group is basically saying it's not about faith. It's about whether you do what we're telling you to do. And basically, they're wanting to draw the new Christians away to traditional Judaism. And Paul doesn't think that they're just mistaken in their doctrine. He thinks that they are subversive. They are, in law, we would say this is premeditated. They have thought this out. They have infiltrated the group, and they have definite plans for what it is that they're trying to do. I really wanted to draw that distinction because in church circles, we have a lot of different denominations that don't always see eye to eye with one another. But in like a little church like this, we try to come together in spite of the fact that we might think differently about different things. And I think that that's a good thing. But when we come to a passage like this, think, wow, Paul is really opening the ball on these guys. Unfit for any good work, detestable. And so I wanted to retitle this section, not false teachers, but subversive teachers, and sort of alert us as a Christian church. That still happens today, particularly in the hierarchical churches. It's interesting. Presbyterian, Anglican, Methodist churches, they created these hierarchies with the idea that they would thereby protect their doctrine. But if you infiltrate the top of the hierarchy, then, of course, you affect everything below it. And we've seen that happen in our government systems as well. Individuals will infiltrate a system with the idea of subverting it. And they're not entering into it in sincerity. They've already decided against it, but there's a lot of people there, there's a lot of power there, there's a lot of money there, and they want to turn it to their own advantage. That, I think, is what Paul's talking about in this passage. So, I mentioned Cretans are pirates. I mentioned that elders do not always have to have kids who are religious believers. I think that's probably not the case. And I mentioned subversion. Let me see if there's any questions about that. And I got a fourth one here. A lot of these have to do with the titles of the sections, but the titles are important because they set the tone for everything that follows. And as my first time going through this lesson was probably about 15 years ago, and as I looked it back over again, I thought, let's see, that was back in 2005, 6 maybe. I thought, no, there's a lot that needs to be changed. Yes?
It seems from what I'm reading that he is still talking about the Titus, the Cretan teachers.
Mm-hmm.
Where he's saying there, the ones of the circumcision party, those are still, he's still referring to the people teaching in Crete, correct?
Yes. So they're on the island of Crete. They're upsetting whole families by their teaching, and then one of the Cretans, a prophet of their own, said, liars, evil beasts, lazy gluttons. Therefore, rebuke them sharply. So we know that there were Jewish teachers on the island of Crete. But they're definitely Cretan teachers. And they're urging circumcision after the Jewish fashion. Now, I don't know if that answers your question, but that's certainly the case. Chapter 2, verse 1, the next thing I would change, I think in my original lesson, I called this the household code, and I don't think that's correct. Chapter 2, verse 1, I would like to rename the role of the church family. As I look through this section, chapter 2, verses 1 through 10, I titled this on analogy to similar sections found in other letters by Paul, where he gives different roles to husbands, wives, and children. But as I look through chapter 2, I don't see references to husbands and wives and children. In fact, I see references to older men, older women within the church. And so what I think is going on here in chapter 2 is our author is not talking about how families should run. Our author is talking about how should the older members of the church, who have been believers for a long time, affect the younger members of the church. So I've talked about the role of church family, emphasis church. Now, there are passages in 1 Timothy and other letters of Paul where he talks about families. Absolutely.
And like
Ephesians.
more of a household code.
It's more of a household code. Now, I entitled this the household code on analogy to Ephesians, but that's a mistake.
They're not the same.
They're not the same. Absolutely not. This doesn't have to do with families. This has to do with the church family. The older believers. And he actually uses a word very close to presbyteroi. Older men, older women. They're not husbands and wives necessarily. They're just older believers. And so the idea here on the island of Crete is that people who have been believers for a season, they can help the younger people find their way. That's what's going on here. And I thought, well, that's it's different. And it's a very, very interesting idea. So I would like to say he's talking about the church family.
And 1 Timothy appears, at the first glance, to be more of a church family type situation as well, right?
Mm-hmm.
Which would be very instructive for New Tech or
Yes.
Pastoral Baptist
And the pastorals in general are very concerned about the church family. That doesn't mean that the nuclear natural family is unimportant to Paul. Of course it is, and he deals with it. You mentioned Ephesians. But there's a danger, and I've fallen into it myself, which is why I'm giving this lesson today. You see two passages that are similar, and you immediately conflate them. But then you become insensitive to the differences between them. And so as I looked over this passage this last week, and the week before, I said to myself, this isn't really about family structure. This is about church structure. And even though I've taught it as though it were about family structure, I'm going to have to change it. It's a pain, but I'm going to have to change it. So if we look at chapter 2, verse 1, teach what accords with sound doctrine. And then in verse 2, he says, older men. He doesn't say husbands. He doesn't say fathers. He just says the old guys. And from what's followed with the elders of the church, it's evident here that Paul has the idea that there is an official church elder, but beneath him there are unofficial elders who are people who are seasoned in the faith, and they may be husbands or wives, but it doesn't matter. The point is that they've been believers for a long time. And many of the prescriptions here are the same. Sober-minded, dignified, self-control, sound in faith, love, and steadfastness. So, he wants people who have been believers for a long time to have these qualities. And then he goes on to the older women, which will be interesting when we get to 1 Timothy, because the older women are to have a role in training younger people within the church. He doesn't draw a distinction between men and women here. Women are to be reverent, not slanderers, so they're not off in corners going, with urgent, exasperated looks on their face, talking about so-and-so, or slaves to much wine. Teach what is good, and so train the young women to love their husbands and their children. So there already a distinction is drawn. They're helping the younger women who are probably wives and mothers. You brought this up last week. Why would they not love their husbands and their children? But maybe on the island of Crete, if it's a pirate colony, maybe, it's pretty mercenary there, and it's like, well, you got to look out for yourself.
There's always division within marriages. There's always disruption.
But I think in chapter 2, I've read many commentaries where this is framed in terms of family rules, and I think we need to leave that aside. I think that this is about the church. And we do that when we do baptisms, and I call upon the church to say, help with the upbringing of this young person in the faith of the Lord. Verse 6, chapter 2, urge the younger men to be self-controlled. Good advice for young men. And then in verse 9, bondservants are to be submissive to their own masters in everything, well-pleasing, not argumentative, not pilfering, showing good faith. Now, I don't have anything to add to verses 11 through 15. We covered those last week. So, first correction, I wanted to note that Crete is a pirate colony. Then the second, I wanted to note. Yeah, fire away.
So for the chapter 2, you're saying that you think it's about church family, how they should raise those.
Right, not about the natural family, husband, wife, kids, what their roles are, but the church family, older believers, men or women, and the effect on the younger people. Continue.
So when Paul or whoever wrote this starts mentioning bondservants, is it assumed that the bondservants of a certain family go with them to church?
Yes.
Okay.
Because a servant will be considered, it's offensive today, but not then, the property of whoever their master is. And so they will accompany them oftentimes to the service. Now, if they go to the service in the absence of their master, that's a possibility here. Then it's all the more important that they're obedient to their master. Think of it this way. If I'm a slave owner and I allow my servant to go to a church service, and once he comes back, he starts disobeying me and stealing my stuff and saying he's my equal, I'm not going to send him back to that church service, right? Like, What are they teaching you there? They're teaching you to be subversive. I'm not going to send you there. And so Paul is saying, if you're a servant, Paul isn't saying slavery is okay. And this will come up when we get to 1 Timothy. What he is saying, though, is that even though you're free in Christ, what will you do with that freedom? Use that freedom to win the people in your life to sacrificial love and obedience. And how are you going to do that? You're not going to do that by stealing their stuff and being disobedient. You're going to do that by showing them, hey, I'm free from you, and yet I will be a good servant to you. Christ has made me free, and yet I will respect you and operate within the bounds of the law. I think that's Paul's idea, is that that's the better way to win people over than what today they'd call sort of revolution. Paul is not a revolutionary. He doesn't believe that the way forward is to topple governments and systems through force, which inevitably ends in violence and bloodshed. French Revolution is a great example of that unleashing of power. So, good question. So I'm going to talk a little bit about Crete as an island of pirates, elders, whether their kids have to be believers. I've offered a different interpretation of the Greek there. And then also this section, church families. It's not about the natural family. It's about the church family. And in my original lesson, I just feel that what I had put down there, there's not a nice way to put it, was wrong. It was wrong. It needed to be changed. It was, it wasn't totally wrong, but that's why we do these classes, right? To have that engagement with the text. It's good for you, and then it's good for me, because I go back to the text and I look at stuff maybe I taught 5-10 years ago, and I scratch my head and I think, yeah, I don't know about that. I have to go back.
You were talking about the hierarchy of certain denominations.
Yeah.
We have friends who were going to a Presbyterian church and they were going to be like deacons. So they had to agree to all these doctrinal things that they didn't actually agree with. I mean, they don't actually agree.
But they signed them anyways, didn't they?
I don't think they did.
Oh, good for them.
I think they said, no, we don't agree with it.
So they're not going to be, but they'll still fall into this.
We'll still go to the church.
And then, they'll still be older men and women.
I think that with our Christian schools and our churches, the levels of doctrinal specificity that certain schools and churches require are very detailed. And if you look at these letters by Paul, they're fairly, I don't want to use the word liberal because that's a bad word in our culture, but they're freeing. That these people the elders should be monogamous. They should be able to manage their families and their bank accounts. They should answer to their own conscience and be people of integrity and not having anything going on the side that might malign their position of the church. And beyond that, it's not like you said, you've got to agree to these 17 different doctrinal statements. So I'm with you there. So I've admonished older men, older women, younger women, and then the slaves. We have a talk about the gospel. And then I think we come to how should Christians behave. Chapter 3, verse 1. In chapter 3, verses 1 to 11, we get to the section that actually deals with Christian behavior, and then Paul will bring it to conclusion. I won't do that this week. It'll be next week. Yeah.
Last week I asked you if you do a mini sermon on redemption this week, but you don't have time, so next week.
We got 5 minutes. Do you want to, what did you want to?
You want to cover that in 5 minutes?
I'll put it this way. Ask me the question because we have 5 minutes, and it'll be a good cliffhanger if I can't finish the whole thing.
I felt I got short shrift back in chapter 2.
Okay.
So, redeem us from all lawlessness. I first want you to describe what biblical redemption means, and then specifically what it means in this passage, because it says something very specific. Redeem us from all lawlessness. But when we talk about redemption and being redeemed by the blood and those sort of things, first of all, what does that mean? Give us a mini sermonette on that.
Okay, so the question is, within 5 minutes, and we'll pick it up again next week because this is a big question. Chapter 2, and I think beginning in verse 11? But he goes on in the specific passage you mentioned is in verse 14. He gave him.
Covered that great navigator's memorization course verse. Very well, but that redemption part.
Yeah.
We have some other questions.
So let's pick up today in chapter 2, verse 14, and we'll pick it up again next week. God through Christ, gives himself for us, here's the key phrase, to redeem us from all lawlessness and to purify for himself a people for his own possession who are zealous for good works. And so a mini sermonette on that. Is that the question? Okay, absolutely.
Well, I'm sorry. The mini sermonette beginning with biblical redemption, because I think it says something a little bit different here.
Mm-hmm.
Covering something a little bit different. But when we talk about being redeemed by the blood, those sort of things, that gets thrown around very easily. I just wanted to kind of define it in a sermonette, and then tackle what it means exactly here.
So let me go in a few small steps. But to take the idea of redemption, let's start with that. This idea has its origin in the Old Testament. I think I understand it with the idea of to buy back, and by implication for a price. And that implies a debt. So the idea is that a debt is owed. There's the old saying, there's no such thing as free lunch. If you get a free lunch, someone is paying. There's no such thing as free lunch. Maybe you get free lunch. Someone, somebody, somewhere is paying for that meal. Things don't just drop out of the sky. This is a very important idea because I've certainly had counseling sessions with people who say, well, if God wanted to forgive us, why didn't he just do it? The idea being that all he had to do was say, don't worry about it. What's with the whole cross, Why was that necessary? And to my mind, it was sort of like trying to explain to a small child about inflation. Why can't you just print off money and give it to people? Yeah, I've heard that from kids, in elementary school. Why can't you just run the printing? There's these people without any money. You got the printing presses.
Pastor, forget children. You get adults.
You get adults that say that. Just print dollar bills and...
That's what it's called.
So you pull the child aside and you try to not embarrass them, and you say, look, there's certain dynamics of the way the world works. You can't just print money and hand it off to people. And in the same way, when we not just as individuals, but as a race, we've sinned. Adam and his race. It's not just that we're guilty, but we have left in our wake, even after we're dead, the consequences of all of the wrong that we've done. And everybody else has to live and pay for them. And we're deluding ourselves if we think that it's just, that's not the case. That's true of me. I've got 4 children of my own. They're not here right now, so I can say this. I love them to death. I've done everything I know that I can for them. But I am telling you, I have damaged every last one of my 4 kids. And it isn't because they wanted to. It's because the things in my life that are not sorted have passed into theirs. And I've done as much as I knew that I could, but I have to be honest with myself, right? I mean, who are we kidding? They're going to face those things. And they will be things that they've inherited from yours truly. And I'm not going to own all of that because I didn't come into this world with a clean slate either, right? So it's not like, well, I take all the responsibility for it. I got parents of my own, and they got parents of their own, and so on back it goes. So the idea of redemption is that there's a price.
There's also a process.
A process to pay the price.
Well, there's also the process of purification.
Yes.
And there's the process of redeeming us from lawlessness. We're lawless. I mean,
So purity and a redemption from lawlessness. The opposite of purity is impurity. So this is the idea, very close to the idea of perfection. Even when we do good things, there are other motives involved. I would say it's probably fair to say that I've never done in my entire 47 years of living one completely pure thing. There's always...
Other than teach yourself how to play the game. I'd say that counts.
No, there is some kind of ulterior motive. The point, though, is that purity involves no admixture of anything other than what is holy and godly. So there's only one person we know of in the whole universe who's ever done that, and that's Christ. So if we believe in Christ, we believe this is the miracle, that there was actually a human being who was completely pure. He never did anything from any ulterior motive whatsoever. And God intends to make of us, you and I, that kind of a person. I don't know how that's... Good luck. Good luck. So that's what I understand by purity. And then redemption from lawlessness, I think, is the idea of the new law, which is love. And I like to add the word sacrificial love, because people mean different things by the word love. But we'll get to this with 1 Timothy. Many of the Gnostics, particularly, had this idea that because we have been liberated by Christ from the law, that therefore we don't have to even obey the laws of the state or even moral laws. We can just do whatever we want. And Paul pushes back against that idea we have been liberated from this world and its fallen laws, but we have been, we've got some people coming in. There's a new law, which is the law of love. And so, maybe a good example from Titus, and then I'll have to end here because we're past time. Why would a slave continue to be obedient to their master? What's that? Exactly. It's not because they believe in the system of slavery. It's not because they believe that their master's better than them. They're free from all of that. They don't believe in any of that anymore. That's why the gospel is dangerous. It has this potential to subvert the whole of the existing order of the Greco-Roman world. But Paul says, look, but you are under a new law of love. And so you're going to show respect to your master for reasons completely different than what he thinks are the reasons why you're doing what you're doing. And that can be applied to a dozen other situations. I have to stop there because I'm past time. And I'll stay and we can talk. But I'll pick it up next week because this is a good question and that's where the cliffhanger is.